and it shows that we are streaming on this side too. So hello everyone, welcome to our what would be our noon session in the Mountain Time Zone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Kelsey Ducheneau. I'm the Natural Resources Director for the Intertribal Agriculture Council. Today we have with us Graeme Hand for our noon session titled Hand for the Land. Graeme Hand is a consultant that has worked as an industrial chemist, international marketer, meat industry consultant, as well as a farm consultant to many family and corporate farmers. He's trained farmers and herders and spoken at universities and conferences in Mongolia, India, Brazil, the United States, and Canada. He's based in the Huon Valley in southern Tasmania and has a special interest in working with family farms, helping to create profitable, sustainable farm businesses, which are enjoyable to work on. Graeme farms beef cattle in Tasmania and New South Wales and is the CEO of Stepa Native Grasses Association, a not-for-profit charity that promotes the use of native grasslands in agriculture. He also runs his own consultancy business and has delivered workshops across Australia and internationally and virtually with us today. His expertise is broad and includes knowledge about cropping and grazing, farm financial health, planned grazing, and foraging, as well as cover cropping. I'd like to take a quick minute to thank our sponsors, our champions for native agriculture. And with that, I'm going to throw it over to you, Graeme.
Great, thanks, Kelsey. That was a lovely introduction. Yeah, so I'm here in southern New South Wales today, and I'm very excited to be doing a presentation. So I might go ahead and share my screen and go from there. Does that work for you? Just make that bigger. Yeah, so I'd like to thank the IAC and Kelsey for getting me to talk today. I'm sort of running out of room for all the logos around my front page, but basically I'm a member of Holistic Management International and the Savoury Institute, manage the Australian Native Grass Association, which I think is really important. Promoting Australian native grasses. They're less productive, but they're more profitable because they're more resilient. And our rainfall's about twice as variable as the rainfall in the US. And this allows people to make money in a highly variable rainfall, relying on their native grasses. So, yeah, I'm a big fan of your prairies as well. So, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm presenting from today and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. So, and I'm on a few other non-profits and things like that. So I won't go into this very much, just my story, and Kelsey sort of introduced it, but the big things that I believe that I've managed to work on is actually those areas, barriers to adoption down the bottom, from a Canadian guy that's very good at working out why people aren't adopting new practices and also understanding complexity. But yeah, my main driver has been Alan Savoury and working with Alan. So where I am at the moment is we've had the last 12 months has been a bit of a turmoil. We've had drought and dust storms. We've had bushfires that surrounded the whole town. This is where I'm, the little town that's got the tower that I'm presenting through. And it was just completely surrounded for weeks. And all it needed was one big day of wind, and it was completely circled and it would have got burnt out, but that didn't happen. And then the rains came. And then in typical Australian fashion, it came as a flood. So this is the road in and out of the little town. And it really sort of, it went from drought to fire to flood to COVID. So it's going well now. We've got grass and stuff. So it's looking pretty good. I just wanted to say that one of the causes that I see for our floods and fires, and that is that we've basically with cats and foxes and land management, we've basically made extinct in most areas these ground-dwelling marsupials. So, the quolls, that little spotted one up the top left, that's like a marsupial cat, and the others are like these digging rodenty, a bilby down the bottom right there, and they turned over and promoted biological decay of the litter, but also kept the soil open and friable, and they're basically all been made extinct. So a lot of the practices that people have used for thousands of years in Australia are going to struggle to be reintroduced until we can do something about restoring that. So I have a focus on they really drove our grasslands and kept that litter layer cycling and decomposing, and we're going to have to mimic other processes until we can breed up. Some of these little ground-dwelling marsupials are still on Tasmania and on the islands, so hopefully we can breed them up, and people are putting them back into environments. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is how rapid, if you practice sort of regenerative grazing, which is sort of my special topic really, how quickly you can get things to improve. So I'll show you what that was like before it started, but basically it was bare sandy soil when we started, and within 2 years with grazing only, no fertilizer, no seed, no herbicides, apart from just using the animals in a very strategic way. So I like to put that slide up because one of the partners with us on that was Sydney University, and in Australia, that gives you some credibility there. I'll be talking about the different levels of change, but basically I'll be focusing on redesign, not on efficiency. Most people, the first thing they think of is how do they make things efficient. I think of nitrogen fertilizer as the one here that people think about putting a coating on the fertilizer. At that substitution level, you're replacing a toxic input with a less toxic input. So it might be composted chicken litter at that substitution, but at that deep redesign, you're actually managing the soil surface in a way that allows biological nitrogen to be in the soil. So this is putting life into the soil that then the plants can access through their association with fungi. So we'll be talking at that deep redesign. This is the definition that I use for regenerative ag, just that intersection between the people, the profit, and the land. So we have a system of scoring agricultural farmers and ranchers in Australia on wellbeing scores, so both physically and mentally. And the other one that I always like to add on to that is, are they actively promoting agriculture? So if you go into a property as a consultant, you actually very quickly pick up, are they actively promoting agriculture as a thing that's good for their children, for others? There's a real, and I'd imagine it's the same in the US, there's a real line that when you go in, you know that the farm's not going very well. And that's when people are saying things like, the best thing is the children don't want to be ranchers. And I go, oh, that's the best thing. So they've got to be actively promoting, the profits are stable or increasing, and then the land increasing landscape function and biodiversity. And I was just going to quickly go through that landscape function. So landscape function is just a way of assessing the soil surface. So we need to be able to assess the soil surface. This is one of the researchers in the white hat that he developed this technique. And that's me. I'm taking a knee, kneeling down there. And he's explaining what he's looking at. So he really understands how the land's organized and how it actually functions, and that's really interesting. And And the man in the blue shirt's Colin Seiss, who I work with a lot, and he's sort of developed a cropping technique of planting into dormant native grasslands, so so he can get crop as well as not destroy the soil by taking out the grasslands. So I'm a big grassland fan. I keep saying they're the lungs of the earth where the forests aren't. So, and then I put up a map of the world and show people that the grasslands are the lungs of the earth for your prairies, for most of Australia and big parts of Africa and the Asian steppe. This is just quickly landscape function. It's a bit death by PowerPoint. So what do you have to measure on the left-hand side so that you can predict the stability or lack of erosion, the water infiltration, and the nutrient cycling? And it's quite simple, the relationships, but they've been proven up, and you can actually measure and get a scientifically valid result for it. So, you know, if it's going to be stable and not eroding, it's got to be covered. So it's either soil cover or litter cover. If it's going to infiltrate water, that's a little bit more less intuitive. It's the basal cover. So how you need sort of grasses with big bases, big perennial grasses covering as much of each acre as you can. So that's what that basal cover. So the bases, they've got to be more than 3/4 of an inch by 3/4 of an inch before they start to be counted. And then that litter cover again to break the impact of the rainfall drops, and then that surface roughness to slow the water down as it moves across. And we just assess that over a yard or a metre, and then the height between the bottoms and the tops of the soil surface, and hopefully that's by plants. The really big one is the really big one is nutrient cycling. Again, it's that basal cover and all those root exudates. They're like massive big funnels for air and pumping sugars and doing all that Christine Jones had talked about, the liquid carbon pathway and the surface roughness. But the really big one is actually this decomposition of the litter, and I'll focus on that. So once you get that, so at the same surface roughness, you get about 50% of your nutrient cycling from the basal cover of the perennial grass, and 50% of your nutrient cycling by the litter and the decomposition of the litter. So I think of it as sheet composting over the whole landscape. So this is what creates that sort of and gets the nutrient cycling, allows you to wean off inputs, fertilizers and herbicides, because you're getting that weed competition from the perennial grasses, and then you're getting the decomposing litter to cycle your nutrients. And that's the basically a simplified version of what it looks like and what all those different relationships are. I really like this material. It seems to relate to people. It's peer reviewed, which I really like, so that you're not getting into discussions about there's no science, there's no data, there's no evidence, because it's a peer reviewed technique that you can use. And I've used it in India and Brazil and Mongolia, as well as Australia. So it allows you to design what the land needs to look like. So in a grazing area, it needs to be a dense perennial grassland with high landscape function and biodiversity, soil biodiversity. So it's going to need a deep, stable litter layer with visible fungal attack. It's going to need increasing mature perennial grass plants and more than 30 perennial grass species, I say, in Australia. When Europeans first came to Australia, there was over 75 perennial grass species in most areas, but it's almost too much for people if you start talking about sort of 75. So I've had to halve it, really. One of the things to transition to regenerative ag, I think there's confusion about which domain it's in. This is work done by Dave Snowden from Cognitive Edge. And he has a deep understanding. So Alan Savory's holistic management framework's the only practical way of managing complexity that I know. But Dave Snowden's understanding and discussion of complexity is very important as well. So what I'm seeing is that we're trying to get expert views. Sorry, just up in this domain, up in that top right. And we think that someone can tell us, and it really doesn't work there. So because the land's complex, and especially if you're adding in people and their well-being and money as well, then it becomes incredibly complex very quickly. So that means you've got to do trials, and what we call them is safe to fail trials, or for the farmers in Australia and ranchers in Australia, I say just put in some safe to fail areas. So these are small areas that allow you to explore what is the combination of management and behavior that actually improves our land. It's not, there's trends, but it's not always going to respond the same way. So you have to do the work yourself on your land. So I spend a lot of time talking to people about this complexity, and also to put in these safe to fail practice areas. So these are just small areas on the property that if nothing ever grew there again, it wouldn't worry you. You're not going to graze it because it's too small and it's too much trouble. So the example I've got here is a sheep property in southwest Victoria, so right down the southeastern part of Australia here. So it's just grazed for a couple of hours, and it's locked up for a range of recoveries, but always longer than what you're currently doing. So a lot of the advice for the recoveries between grazing events is too short, but this allows you to confirm what that is. So I get people to put in at least one at 6 months recovery and one at 12 months. And being really conscious that Gabe Brown from North Dakota, who's a friend of mine, he uses 14-month recoveries. So this mightn't even be long enough. You probably need one at 24 months as well. But on each property, on each soil type, you're starting to get this information so that you're getting incredibly high quality feedback, because the expert views will not work. The advice is always going to be wrong because it is complex for you. So you really need to do these works yourself. And then put in the animals and leave the soil surface covered. So these are ewes and lambs. It wasn't the stock density that I wanted the woman to do, but the sheep were lambing, so she wouldn't put them in too tight. And then you do a couple of areas with a range of recoveries. You sort of eliminated the variables of utilisation and stock density, and then you can just concentrate, what does this land need for recovery? I believe that a lot of the large migrations of the herbivores were very, very occasional. So I have this image of the bison going to their calving grounds once a year, and then coming back a different way, not necessarily going over the same path. Do you know when they're trying to video the wildebeest migrations and things like that, they find that they build their hides to put their cameras in, and then find that the animals take a different path that they don't repeat, but they're always very big, long, slow recoveries. So I'm saying that's what I see and observe. So if you put in some of these, make sure you're doing a big, long, slow recovery. Excuse me. So I then talk to people a lot about this decomposing litter. So this up in the top left here, this is raw litter on the end of the hand, and this is decomposing litter. This one here is litter really decomposing on the soil surface. So this is between the plants. This was in southern Victoria. This was in central New South Wales. And you're really trying to get it to the point that you've got visible fungal colonization of the litter, because it's at that point that you get a step increase in that nutrient cycling. So this is what creates the conditions for the perennial grasses to thrive. So there's, I'll come back to it. Some of the monitoring that we do is just really simple. This is just throwing a dart and trying to get random samples and see what it landed in. So very simple kit. You've got to be able to do it a couple of times, I find, to calibrate, and then you get really experienced at walking over the land and working at what's happening and what's not happening. So in this, this is just an example. So I've thrown the dart and it's landed near this grass plant, and then you just fill out the form. So I won't go into too much depth, but everyone can see that that's bare soil, it's capped. There's evidence of soil movement because you've got pedestaling of little stones and pebbles. So you just go through, fill out that. There was evidence from other insects. What was the plant? What was the grass, if you know it? What was the distance to it? Because that distance from the dart to the nearest perennial grass plant should be decreasing if your management's going well, and it'll be increasing if your management's not going well. And then as that increases, you start to get more weeds and forbs and other plants coming in. What's its age structure? You need to have a combination of seedlings and young and mature plants, and then something about its basal area. So, what was its width? What was its breadth? So you've got to measure it two ways, and then what was the distance to it? So, excuse me, I got those out of order. But yeah, so it's that type of simple monitoring. I just do 10 throws. And then if it doesn't work, if it's not, sorry, let me explain that. If it doesn't, I then stand up and look around and say, have I captured what I see in front of me? If I haven't, I'll do another 10 throws. But throwing that dart, doing random throws is really brutal. There's nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. You can't kid yourself. So I try and always make sure when I'm walking on the land that I'm looking for that decomposing litter and the large perennial grass bases, and thickening up with that. But I also then throw the dart once or twice a year because it recalibrates you and doesn't allow you to lie to yourself. But one of the things that really I'm really keen on is not just the monitoring, but what do you do? So using that framework of the landscape function, it gives you sort of possible corrective actions. So I've tried to soften this. I used to just be black and white and say, this is the cause, this is the corrective action, and people would argue. So if you put possible in front of it, they seem to be very much happier. So if there's bare ground between the plants, you're not going to be getting enough nutrient cycling, you're going to be getting erosion. So what's the possible cause? That the recovery was too short, and then check increasing the recovery in the possible corrective actions. So really just sort of trying to say, this is what I saw, this is the possible cause, what's the possible corrective action, and then doing a trial to check. Before you change too much, agriculture punishes quick movement. So you've really got to know what you're doing and how it's going to work before you do it. So if the litter's not decomposing, it's not in contact with the soil, check increasing the stock density, and usually do it in a trial area. The plants are increasing in spacing, the recovery is too short, check increasing the recovery. So trying to be very logical and step through all these. So I'll make sure that I send this through to Kelsey and stuff in the presentation, so that you can all get those and those forms if people are interested and want them. So one of the things is, if a grassland, if a prairie is running really well, it'll have that lots of decomposing litter. And as it starts to decline, the first thing you lose is the decomposition of the litter, even before you lose the litter. So if you can catch it at that point and start increasing the litter, you can great, thank you. You can start doing you can start taking corrective action before it ends up in disaster. So you lose the decomposition, you lose the litter, then you start losing the grasses. So if you catch it up with that first early warning, and Alan Savory is really big on making sure that you're doing that early warning so that you're taking action before it becomes a problem. I have a real clear definition, looks like an ungrazed plant of sort of when is a grass ready to be grazed and contains fresh yellow litter. In Brazil, I found that the recoveries had to be longer, even though the growth was incredibly fast. The rate of decomposition was incredibly fast as well in the areas that I was working on. You know, it could chew through sort of 6 inches of litter in a couple of weeks, which was just unheard of in our Mediterranean environment. So it depends on temperature and soil moisture and previous management. So you're just using this thinking and management to find out. Most people I still find are overgrazing. They're grazing plants. So this is a plant ready to be grazed. It's then been grazed severely. Most of our domestic grazers are severely grazed in that top middle. Then it mobilizes its root reserves and starts putting up fresh leaf. Let me see if I can get that. So, and in this one here, this is, if you graze the plant here, this is where you would overgraze it and eventually weaken it and kill it. So this is grazing leaf that's grown from root reserves, where you actually need to get back and have that fresh litter in the grass plants so that you know that you're going to build landscape function. Here, you would not technically kill the grass, but you would not build that decomposing litter in the intertussock space. So I think it's really important to be checking this. And as I say to most of the Australian farmers, I wouldn't take advice from me. I would go home and check it. So make sure that we go and do that. So the three big risks in agriculture are debt, seasonal rainfall, and market price, and in that order. So I'm always driving people away from debt. How can they reduce their debt? Because it lowers their risks. And even with really low interest rates, I still find that people try and clear the debt too quickly. It's almost like a gambler, sort of, they're trying to pay off the debt really fast rather than slow and steady. So, and doing it over time. The rainfall risk is about increasing the recovery between grazing events because you're working on leaf emergence rate. If you increase the recovery time, you're going to have more opportunities for getting the right rainfalls and the right temperatures, and market prices being a really low cost producer. So we have people now that their cost of production is 10% of their sale price, not the other way around. So everywhere I go in the world, they tend to have their cost of production to produce a kilogram of beef, say, or a pound of beef, it costs them sort of 90% of the income of that to run the business. So we're flipping that around so that they're keeping the 10 cents in the dollar, not someone else keeping the 90 cents in the dollar. We use satellite monitoring. So this graph, and it's a bit hard to see, but the that graph on the right there is the blue line's rainfall and the orange is relative ground cover. This is using satellite data to get the sort of what is the green material, what is the litter material, and what is the bare ground. So it's really taking the US satellite MODIS data and other satellites and putting it through an algorithm and giving you a relative ground cover, and you can compare it to your neighbors or to the region, or you can actually compare it to a specific farm. So I always think I could use it for evil, because there's a lot of people saying they know what they're doing, but when you look at their satellite data, it's not always so. This is where the farm that my cows are on at the moment. So I'm just near Araluen. So in this period here, they were consistently lower in ground cover than the district average. Then they did some holistic management training, and they bounced around with the rainfall. And now we've stabilised it. So even though we've had this real run of really poor rainfalls and things, that's turned around this year. But the ground cover has continued to go up, and it's very, very stable. So, you know, like it just keeps ticking on. So it's that stability that allows people to be profitable. In this period here, they were buying animals and selling animals, and they'd have grass and then they wouldn't have grass. And what I find is a lot of people master that art of buying high and selling low, so they lose money out of the business because they haven't got a stable feed base that allows them to coolly and calmly make money every year. So we're trying to never run out of grass. Grazing only fails if you run out of grass. Bud Williams and others have talked about that. And we just use those leading soil surface indicators. So this is Farm Map 4D. I don't think it's available in the US, but there will be soon, I'd imagine, some equivalents. And then we just use throwing the dart and drone mapping. I like the data to be auditable and to be scientifically valid, so that you're not kidding yourself, that you can actually show people the evidence of what it is. This is just an example of one of the projects we worked on. The area we had was really just down here in the foreground. Didn't get a good photo of it. You know, it's always the way, but it was basically just through this gate. And this was in September 2012. And then within 2 years of just using that information we had and gaining, that it went back to this grassland. That's my eldest son. He wasn't enjoying himself. It was miserable cold and it was wet. And we'd been monitoring and traveling thousands of miles, sort of, so he was exhausted. He'd had enough. But this soil so it went from this light, sandy, bare, you know, I'm sure you can imagine what it was like, to chocolate cake very, very quickly. So within 2 years, we had it back to that real deep, rich humus layer, massive increase in organic matter in the soil. So when European man came to Australia, a lot of the soils were incredibly high in organic matter from the way people had been managing for thousands of years. You know, so they'd been maintaining ground cover, doing all that sort of work. Yeah, so you know, up to 18-20% organic matter. So, and that's what we can do within 2 years, which I think is really exciting. And I think it's fantastic that we can turn this around, because like I was always taught when I was growing up that, you know, it's taken Europeans a couple of hundred years to wreck it. It's going to take us, you know, twice as long, you know, so 600 years to fix it. And I thought, oh, that's a bit depressing. But if you do the right things, if you work on using that monitoring, that landscape function, all those techniques, then the change is incredibly quick. So I might just skip through a few slides. I use animal-based monitoring, which I find works really well for people, that they actually learn to monitor the animals rather than the practice. I'm very much focused on outcomes. So what are the outputs? What are the outcomes? So we're shifting the animals onto the next paddock based on the animals. Based on the animals. So we put them into a paddock based on the perennial grass recovery, and we take them out based on the animals. And that's how we get animal performance in that management that's using grass that's got more fiber, less protein and energy. So how do we do that? And we're just using that rumen fill as a guide. We use dung scores to see if there's a nice match between the feed on hand and where the rumen is. It's very dynamic, but basically if it's too loose, if they've got diarrhea, the grass is too young. If it's a bit too like a horse, dry and fibery, then the grass is too old or too low in protein and energy. And you're looking for that nice pie with a dip in the middle. It's a little bit too much. And do the same for sheep, gut fills and stuff. It's just a little bit harder to monitor those. So with doing that, we get excellent animal health while you're actually regenerating the land. I'm a big believer that most of this grazing management was to mimic nature. So this is out of one of David Attenborough's Planet Earth, the Great Plains. And what people are struggling with was how did the animals get that stock density? And it's just, I don't think we've really understood at that sort of, that's just an exploded view, at that incredibly large herds, if the stock density, so this front along here, let me just grab my pointer, this front along here, which I think when in the video, it looks like a fire going through the grassland, is at an incredibly high stock density because everyone's up at the front trying to get a feed. There's also animals at the back. But what we try and do is say, well, if that's the way those mega herds and really large herds of herbivores worked, then let's mimic that. So we go for that high stock density and we leave the litter behind. We don't pick up the litter. So we're getting them to eat the green, but leave so the green's for the animal, when it's growing, green for the animal and litter for the soil. So we're waiting to grow the litter and then we put the soil on the ground and the green material through the animals. So I partition them in my head so that we know what's going on. So this is where my cows are and we're just running them in strips. So it's very much like Johann Zietzmann's fencing design. The water's at the back. There's no back fence. So these animals back here, those ones back there are going back to the water, which is just out of the photograph over here. So they're wandering back to get a drink. And that works really well. So there's some great photos of this and how it works, and the animals would, so if they can, everyone goes, oh, it's a bit cruel having them that tight. And I go, yeah, but there's no fence. They choose to do it, but you do have to select for them. You do have to actually make sure that you're actually selecting for cattle or sheep or whatever your grazing animal is. They enjoy that social contact. They enjoy that friction. They can perform in that. They can calve in that. They don't lose their calf in that. So what I have running through my head is that typically we would modify the land to suit the animals. This is about selecting the animals, not modifying them, selecting the ones that will work in a regenerating perennial grass. So you're not trying to eat the grass at the optimum. I think I've been training since the mid-90s, and I think it's only recently that I've realized that it actually isn't about the grass. It's actually about people. So the ones that do really well in our droughts, consistently make profit, that are going really well, they have big, long, slow recoveries that are outside the optimum for the grass, but it gives them time to react. So if it stops raining, they actually have time to reduce their stocking rate before they run out of grass. So what happens normally I see with people is that if it stops raining in Australia, so say we have 4 weeks of no rain in the growing season, people then go, oh, it might have stopped raining. I better wait for another month to see if it really has stopped raining. and then they actually start to then go, oh, now I've got to start reducing my stocking rate, and that takes another month. So I'm seeing this 2 to 3 month delay in people. Sorry, the sun's come up. In people reacting to the change in seasons. So if you have too short a recovery, you don't get time to react. So it's about people and reacting, and how quick they react, and how they've designed the enterprise so that it's easy and profitable to reduce their stocking rate when things change. So I'm always being incredibly conservative and building in extra buffers to allow time for people to pick up what's changing, so that they're doing it in a controlled and sensible way. So what I was going to say is, so what Peter does, so this is at Naringla, where the farm that sort of my cows are on, and where I'm living at the moment. And what we do is he plans for 12 months recoveries. And then if it gets down to 9 months, he sells animals to get back up to 12 months. So he's always got grass in front of him, no matter what happens. And even in our severe droughts, so you'll get less than 50% of the rainfall, you still grow some grass if you're managing well. So it's just sort of, he'll step down the stocking rate, the number of animals that he has, so that he never runs out of grass, and the lands are always being looked after. You're not taking a harvest out of the land each time there's a problem. So what I see on a lot of farms and ranches is that there's this continual soil health decline, because each drought, each problem, each thing is leading to slower and lower productivity of the land, and lower soil biodiversity. So it's about sort of making sure that you never fail. So success is about never failing, not optimizing production. And the farmers that I work with, I give them a warning that if someone's talking to you about doubling your stocking rate, you need to go and get someone else to talk to. You really aren't interested in increasing the number of animals. You really are interested in stable, increasing profits. So to me, that's the same paradigm as the conventional industrial agriculture, that they focus on increasing production, which increases intensity, which increases your exposure to debt, rainfall, and market price, which lowers your profit. So there's some work coming out really about how good that is. So I'll just skip through. I've got a few more slides and I'll put them in, but I have a bit of a plan of what is the best way to implement regenerative grazing. And it's about getting high quality feedback, putting in some waters, developing grazing plans, doing some trials with strips, and looking at that design. How are you going to build it? Are you building them at the right width? And then pushing the animals to get them to sort of start to change their behavior. So that Dr. Fred Provenza from Utah State talks about a lot about epigenetic change, where if he feeds ewes a high salt diet, the lambs will always have a higher salt tolerance, because they actually get epigenetic change while they're in utero. And then after you've done that, then you can start picking best bet bulls, but generally they've got to be selected for low cow energy maintenance. So that's an EPD that you have in your Angus in the US, whereas we don't have it in our Angus in Australia. But I keep most of our breeding lines, you can track back to the US Angus database, and I look up their cow energy value and just say, well, this is unlikely this bull's going to work, because his daughters are going to have too much milk and not enough fat. If you select for milk, you select for bigger milk factory, which requires more energy. And then, like I just say, make sure that you're very structured in your breeding. So So after you've done 2 rounds of just using your current bulls and you've pushed them in the grazing, I go immediately, I jump to that sort of recoveries that you've got from your safe to fail areas and as much stock density as you can to get performance. The animals generally have adapted to sort of having a lot more space, a lot more selection. So you tend to put them under a lot of pressure. And then and then start using best bet bulls. So which ones are going to be low cow energy maintenance, and selecting for fat, which Johann Zeitsman would call practical fertility, making sure that you have a tight joining period, and anything that doesn't calve in that first 2 cycles, that 6 weeks, selling that. This in Australia, carving into the best green growing grass doesn't always work, because a lot of the time in our Mediterranean, so your California type situation, your best green growing grass, the animals, the cows are running into dry feed very quickly afterwards. So sometimes it might be best to just calve a bit earlier than that. So we have a very long winter growing season. So we calve at the start of the winter, and that works really well. There's no ideal calving time, I've found, because then we're joining at the shortest day for us. So we leave the calves on the cows for 10 months, just because that's helps them develop. And if they're on mature grass with lots of fibre, then their papillae and their rumens develop fine, and it makes them more robust for the rest of their life. And then we always keep the heifers from the first cycle, the first 3 weeks, as replacement breeders, and select for fat and low moderate to relative to current. So thanks very much. So I got a bit quick near the end there, Kelsey.
Yeah, you bet. But we do have one question that I just wanted to make sure and touch on, because I think it's important. We talk about getting that as we start to transition. A baseline calculation is always a good way to, where did we start, refer back to. And so there's a question about if you've used the DART method to establish baseline data. For example, would it be appropriate for measuring post-fire recovery?
Yeah, it is. And then it also, I use it in 2 ways, that dart throwing. I use it to design. So the landscape functions the basis of that dart throwing. So I use it to design, what does the grassland need to look like? But then you can also use it to suggest what corrective action to take. So trials that I've done in Australia, and they're not scientifically valid, triple replicated, is that when we trample a lot of these bushfire burnt areas, and not pulverize it, so it's a very short, sharp trample with the animals, the recovery is a lot quicker. And I always see that in that ash bed, you're not getting enough soil to seed contact, and you can use the animals to germinate the perennial grasses by giving some soil to seed contact in those burnt areas. But it's not the standard way of looking at things, and it's not the norm. So it can be really stressful for people. So you've got to do it in a small area. Typically, ranchers in Australia will say, "Oh, let's do it in the national park," and I go, "Let's do it on your land first." So, like, why do you have to pick the national park? It's like it annoys them that they can't graze the national parks. So so I say, let's prove that it works. Let's demonstrate. The big problem we have is too much conflict in the world, and people hardening their positions before we get the evidence in. So I just try and back off on that sort of conflict and let everyone come up with their own ideas. And then as long as you can check them in a safe to fail trial, go ahead and do it. It's low cost. And then you've got something to discuss. So I believe what's stopping us progressing is this conflict and choosing, I think it's best not to trample the burnt area. I think it's best to let's do the work, see what happens, and then discuss how we're going to go forward. So
you bet. And this next question plays right into that, I think. where could a rancher look for a set of scientifically valid, but also rancher accessible metrics for grazing land health? You know, we talk about that need for producer friendly resources.
Yeah. So there is simpler ways of doing this than the form, but I just like it because I've always done it. So it's one of those ones. Sorry, it's one of those ones that works in practice really well. But I like the satellite data, and the ranchers like that because it comes in through the computer and they don't have to do anything. So they like that. So that gives them like a whole farm view. Have they got higher land cover than their surrounding areas or their neighbours? So you can set it at different distances out, out to 10 kilometres. Can't do the miles. So yeah, but it's basically anything that you can use to mimic. Sorry, I don't mean to drive people crazy. I know this drives me crazy. To get back to that, so is it covered? Does it have large perennial grass bases? Does it have litter between the plants? And is the litter decomposing? We're worrying about too many things. So in a grazing system, this is the most, it's the fastest healing, it's the most resilient. It was the basis for all our grasslands in Australia, through the prairies, through the savannas. This is the core of what we need to be doing. So when you walk on it, this is what I want people to look at. Is it covered? If you can find a bare ground, the raindrop will fall on the bare ground. And as soon as it falls on, it destroys the structure and stops it from cycling and stops, water infiltration. And then it won't allow air in because it gets capped and sealed, and then you don't get any nutrient cycling. So I run this in my head, but I don't know whether that works for people. But really the image is, I either stand on a big perennial grass base or I stand on decomposing litter. So as you walk, each step that you take, it should land on a big perennial grass base or decomposing litter. The annual plants aren't as good for the soil as the perennial grasses. But it's like as if they've fallen out of fashion. They're considered to be old-fashioned or something. I don't know what's going on. But like even if you talk to Gabe Brown, who's a great proponent of annual plants for cover cropping and things like that, he'll say if it's just a grazing system, the most profitable low-risk thing is a prairie, a perennial grass-based grassland. So yeah, so I think if you keep that in your head, I stand on a grass or I stand on decomposing litter, and you have to get down and pull that litter apart because it'll have raw litter on the top, but at the soil surface, you want it to be being colonized by the soil fungi and becoming one with the soil. So it's like Velcro. When you try and pull it, you can't pull it out. And that's what provides all that stability, nutrient cycling, and water infiltration. You should be able to hit it with a fire hose and it doesn't move. So that's one of the real images. Gardeners know this. I see them, they'll be watering their garden, and then if they answer their phone, they point it onto the lawn, not onto the garden, while they're distracted. And it's the same thing. We need the whole land to be like that really high functioning grassland.
Absolutely. Well, I just want to bring it back to, one of my favorite concepts of what you're talking about. As we promote more regenerative landscapes and we get to this more prime landscape function, we don't have to be so victim to the changing climate trends. We know that we're already, as ag producers, so victim to inequitable finance structure that often prevents us from having the leniency to destock immediately when we need to due to drought. But if we have a more resilient landscape, we can have a more resilient business plan, knowing that we're capturing every drop of rain and it's going into our soil profile, and we're going to be able to withstand those climate shifts so much more.
Fantastic. Yeah, because I see this management as already climate adapted because you've got that sort of ability to react to the seasons in front of you. So
Absolutely.
if
Well,
yeah, if you're running too fast, there's nowhere to go. So it doesn't work. It all falls apart. So
you bet.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us so early in your morning, but
Yeah.
in the future over there, Graham. We sure appreciate it. We hope that you're able to join us for the rest of the sessions. I did want to take one more minute to just thank our sponsors before we jumped off of here. And this session, a big thank you to our sponsors of the IAC conference. This session in particular was sponsored by our Champions of Native Agriculture sponsors. So we would invite you all to go ahead and take a break, stand up, stretch out, refill your coffee cup if you're still drinking coffee this afternoon, and join us back in one of our final breakout sessions. You just return back to the CVent website where you can enter into our next session. So thank you everyone for joining us.
Right. Thanks.